Hello and welcome. Great to be here. Thanks to Octo Lee and the Octo team for inviting Model Office and my good self. For those of you who don't know who we are, so we are a software development business. So it's very important to note that we're not compliance consultants. So today we're not offering you advice by any means. A bit like, the old days, as Lee will know from being an IFA. At the end of the day, you've got to be very clear on what's being offered. So we are effectively built, we build out governance, risk and compliance, AI-driven RegTech for firms so they can sense check and understand where they are against all relevant rules and regulations in one place, and then automate the gap analysis, audit reporting, client file reviews, all that good audit stuff that takes a lot of time and effort. So hopefully we're giving more MI data and saving some time and costs along the way. We are an multi-award-winning business as well, and we are proud affiliates of the Consumer Duty Alliance. So today's session, Lee has kindly asked me to speak about the fact that the FCA seem to be getting quite active in their engagement with small, medium, large businesses. And one of the key areas that we looked at really was preparing for a regulatory visit. We are certainly seeing that the regulator are very, very active in these areas, because there's various ways that firms can be engaged on a regulatory visit. It could be on site, and obviously with all that comes with that. But it also could be doing it in a hybrid way, where they're doing it like we are today. Or it could be sending their questionnaires and their data information requests out too. So there's various ways of doing it. And I think the most important thing I've picked up of late from the FCA is that, having spoken been asked to speak by the Consumer Duty Alliance at their conference 2 weeks ago, was effectively the FCA stood up and said that they're looking to be a critical friend of the sector and the financial planning profession. So I think that's an important step, and I think that they're here not just to bash us all around the head with a stick. There's lots of carrot there as well. So the key area with Model Office is just to take a look at what we're up to, and the reason why we exist is that we worked with the FCA in 2016-17 on key initiatives such as the advice unit, the RegTech team, as well as the sandbox unit as well. And we came up with what we thought would be a great idea for the FCA to actually build and develop, which is like an audit tool that firms can go on and assess where they believe they are against all the rules and regs. As I've mentioned, they can all then be automated, as well as the gap analysis and so forth, and provide it in real time as well, using a form of AI. And they said they can't do it. They can't do it in a principles-based framework. So we went ahead and built it ourselves. And that's really why Model Office exists. We effectively automate and we digitize and streamline a lot of the audit practice that firms currently do, which is very manual, paper, people driven, and Excel spreadsheet driven, and checklist and checklist and tick box driven. So we automate a lot of that, but we're also about supporting people. So our AI is giving more MI, more data, so people can make quicker decisions and more accurate decisions on their audit responsibilities. Effectively, we're a piece of Blackpool rock, split us in two. In the middle there is evidence-based practice and third line of defense, which I'll talk about a little later. So this slide really is taking a look at the overall approach that the FCA pull in. So the key to today's session really is I think the first and foremost part of anything like this, when we're looking at this positioning piece, is really understanding where the FCA are and why they're doing, why they're really looking at more of a rigorous and proactive stance when it comes to supervising small, medium, large firms. And what we've got here is really a four segmented strategy that we've definitely seen with the FCA over the last few years, where they're shifting from this regulation of, regulation and forget to an iterative, responsive approach, which is holistic. Everything is interrelated and fits in and dovetails in. So, for example, you might be dealing with something like, suitability on client reviews, which then bleeds over into services and products and so forth, as we all know, through the consumer duty. So we need to move away from checklist and tick box compliance arena. They're very much an outcomes-based approach, which really isn't new. I mean, all the stuff that I'm talking about today goes back over a decade, really. And but the key issue is that this is front and center of their flagship piece, which is the consumer duty. And then the most important thing about today's session, when we're talking about preparing for a regulatory visit, is everything should be proportional and proportionate. So it's a shift from one size fits all to a segmented approach and a tailored approach depending on the firm size, and what they do and their regulatory permissions and so forth. And it's highly collaborative. The FCA want to engage in a proactive way with the industry. I was lucky enough to speak at the Consumer Duty Alliance conference 2 weeks ago today, and that was a really good conference for mainly smaller businesses, but they were very keen for them to to actually engage with firms, and they gave a great speech along as running actual breakout sessions, which is unheard of. Chatham House rules breakout sessions, which were absolutely amazing in the way that they were engaging the profession. So that the key area with all of this is really that the FCA are data driven, and we all know that with a data driven regulator, then that means that you yourselves as businesses need to be data driven. And what does that mean? Well, we'll talk about that in a little while, particularly when we talk about regulatory visits. Let's talk about the type of interventions that we can expect from a regulator. So I think the key here is, and again, I was having breakfast a while back with Keith Richards from the Consumer Duty Alliance, and those you may remember him from the PFS, and we both kind of agreed that firms now, whatever the size of the business, should expect a regulatory visit of sorts. I mean, I always ask the question when I'm talking about this type of thing that I always did like a raise hands. How many of you have had a regulatory visit? And very few initially put their hands up to that. When I asked the question about, well, okay, how many of you had a data information request or a questionnaire from the FCA? All the hands start to go up, and well, that's technically a regulatory visit. And there are many different ways that the FCA can conduct that. But the key issue is as well is that they've got lots of interventions, as we can see on the screen here, and the reason why this is important is because the FCA are now effectively self-professed city watchdog, and they're baring their teeth, and they're definitely looking at ways that they can ensure that market integrity, consumer protection, stability of the sector is all there. So from that side of it, we do need to ensure as businesses, as we build our businesses going out. And by the way, I used to be an IFA. I was an IFA for over a decade. So I've kind of been in your shoes if any of you are IFAs and wealth managers and as well as financial planners. But the key area with this is that we need to understand where the FCA are with this and what they're going to be looking for, so that we prepare properly in case this actually happens. And I put a URL at the bottom there, which shows the website, which I'll pull up right now if I can, which hopefully will show there for you, which is their sample business plan website. Now, this is a really neat piece of resource if you're starting to think about, well, what is it that the FCA are going to be looking at and what do they need? Now, this is really a sample business plan is typically what they're expecting from a regulatory business plan, and what they're expecting to see if you're, for example, want to be regulated by the FCA. But it's a really good place to go and revisit, because in here you've got all the relevant information, governments, and that's a drop down menu, and look at what they're looking to review. You've got the compliance areas here and so forth. So you can start to see that there's lots of great resources here. And again, on the, I'm happy for Lee to share and the team and Octo team to share these slides with you all. But the key area is that a lot of the problem has been for too long that with the industry at large and the financial advice sector and the financial planning profession and so forth, whichever way you look at it, there's lots of pointed fingers going on. And as I always say to my two daughters, well, don't forget, if you point that finger at me, there's always three pointed at you. So you need to basically ensure that you kind of get an understanding of where you are as a business first and foremost against all these requirements as you move through. So going back to the slide here, the important thing to mention as well is that we need to understand where the FCA are coming at it from a decision-making framework. And they have this framework. It's self-professed. It's published on their website and so forth. And really looking at obviously identification of the harm and how they're doing that. Well, at the moment, they're moving into the weird and wonderful world of AI. We're an AI RegTech. AI is at the core of what we do. And they're using, areas like web scraping, for example, to look at, bad actors and what they're up to, identify them and so forth in the marketplace. Diagnostic tools, they're looking at root causes. They're using all sorts of tools. I mean, one of the things that I would urge you to do, even if you're not involved in compliance, is get a grip and understanding of the handbook and how it works and what it does and so forth. And one of the key parts of the handbook is the threshold conditions. And how that can affect your business and how you can benchmark against what they're saying and what they require. I'll talk about that in a little while, so that you've got a good understanding of where you fit from that point of view. And that's a diagnostic tool that the FCA could use if they run a regulatory visit with you. Remedy tools is really all about stopping harm quickly. It's all about proportionality, as I've mentioned, and ensuring firms are putting things right. And again, that's all about really understanding what a firm is doing, what a firm has done. It's a bit like the risk management process and the process that you're doing at the moment with good outcomes on the consumer duty. It's looking at where maybe the poor outcomes could be, and then it's evidencing what work you're doing to rectify that. Because this isn't just about the rule of law; it's about the spirit of the law or the rules. And that basically means that you need to that you need to evidence, and evidence-based practice is at the heart of everything here. You need to evidence the steps that you're taking to improve. And if you're doing that, then that's great. The FCA should give you a thumbs up for that. They're not expecting perfection by any means. What they are expecting is that you're showing that you're working on these issues, you identified them, you're managing them, you're monitoring them, and you're reporting them in a clear and meaningful format. And it's an ongoing iterative process, as we've mentioned, and that's the evaluation piece that you can see on the slide. This next area really, it always astounds me when I look at these and I run these type of talks that if you go back and look at all the regulatory papers that the FCA have produced around, for example, suitability, and there's lots. I'm looking at here that I class as the top 8 papers. There's probably one more which I'll touch on. It doesn't really cover direct financial advice from firms themselves, but you've got FG 1105, which is assessing client risk. Great paper, which looks at the failure to collate information, risk willing to take, poor attitude to risk descriptions and so forth. Poor capacity for loss assessments, and use of tools or use of questionnaires and soft skills and so forth to elicit this information from clients. You've got FG 1216 in here, which is all about replacement business, and that's all about shoehorning, retrofitting, and suitability of additional costs and charges and disclosure and all that type of stuff. TR 16.1, which was all about research and due diligence and status quo bias and challenging the norms in the firm, challenging the board, challenging the business, looking at conflicts of interest systems and controls across suitability and wealth management committees and platforms and so forth. And then you've got 21.1, which is all about the vulnerability piece, which we all know about now, obviously, and I'm sure you've done great work there, particularly with the consumer duty. You've got the retirement income advice paper, which was 24.1. Also, but the key area with all this, and also, sorry, the final one is that thematic review on 24, assessing suitability and research and due diligence on the retirement income advice, CRP. And the key area that fascinates me with all this is that there's so much consistency over the last 11 years or 13 years, whatever it's been, which comes up even now. And that paper in March, TR 24.1, the Retirement Income Advice Review, really still is pulling out lots of themes across all these papers, which go back over a decade. So you could argue not much is changing, but a lot's changing, and so firms really across the sector need to really take another look at this, particularly if you've got a visit coming through and so forth, because this is really important when it comes down to the key areas about enforcement and enforcement penalties. So this is a bit of data that Linklaters pulled out last year, which I thought was interesting, which looked at the fact is that the enforcement penalties are going up, but the values are coming down, which basically says to me that they're focusing on smaller businesses as well as larger businesses now. So from that side of it, the FCA are getting real on this, and I always get the feedback. Well, I've never had a visit. I've never had a problem with with the FCA and so forth. Well, that's great. That's fine, but it shouldn't stop you preparing for it. As a business. And it's also all the great work that you've done on particularly the consumer duty, which is effectively joining the dots of all the good work that you're doing so you can prove compliance. Again, that should be reinforced and pulled back into any plan that you've got and putting together to ensure that you've got a robust strategy and framework just in case the FCA come knocking. So the interesting thing is, at Model Office, we've got over 1,000 firms across our platforms. We've got 5 different platforms, and a few of the firms have actually had data information requests, and one of the areas is what I'm putting on the screen right now, which is basically the FCA have come knocking and said, right, okay, well, we want business and advice register information. We want governance, risk, and compliance information across all activities that you're conducting in the business, and we want your consumer duty implementation plan. And I would add to that, what we do at Model Office is that we validate the implementation plan that you've got to make sure on an ongoing basis it's up to speed and up to date against all the relevant rules and regs. And the key area with that is that applies to this. It's not just showcasing, well, this is what we've done and implemented. It's how that's being monitored on an ongoing, it's that iterative process again, on an ongoing basis. And there's a lot of information here. And again, going back to that paper TR 24.1, the retirement income advice paper, the FCA were quite shocked in there, and you could read it in the paper, that the level of data availability in firms was relatively poor. And so, for example, 30%, I think, of client files were just all over the shop, and they didn't have the relevant documents in there. Some of the documents were in there, shouldn't have been in there. And firms were struggling to pull together the data requests in a meaningful format within the time frame that the FCA were asking. So again, ideally, in a data-driven world, that should be available at the touch of one button. And again, that's what we work on at Model Office. We want to build out an ecosystem. We integrate with back office providers so that we can pull that information and build out those regulatory dashboards and apply AI to it and make it really meaningful. But the key area with this is that the FCA aren't messing around here. This, you can see from this particular data request, it's quite a lot of data, and they were given 2 weeks to deliver that in a meaningful format. The areas covered, if an inspector does come knocking on your door, are all up on your screen at this moment in time. And again, there's nothing new here. You'll know a lot of this anyway. Again, it's about that, if you focus on something, it starts to pull it together. And this might not be on your radar by any means, but I'd highly recommend you revisit it at least once a year, so that if it ever happens, and it might, and don't forget, they're not just knocking for all the wrong reasons. They'll be knocking for all the right reasons, because they want to see firms who are doing really good stuff in the market across all their governance, risk, and compliance responsibilities. So here, we've got the top areas of culture and ethics and governance and SMCR and so forth. Lines of defense I'll talk about, because with Model Office, what we do is we empower the third line of defense, which is your internal audit. A lot of firms don't have that, and that's, I would say, is really necessary now, particularly under the consumer duty. Training and competence, all the way through, to outsourcing resilience. One of the things that's often missed that we see is actually operational resilience. A lot of smaller businesses say, well, that doesn't apply to us. Well, that's fine, but it's guidance in the handbook, and it's good practice. So ideally, you should be applying it to your business. If you're using outsourced, suppliers, if you're using outsourced compliance firms, if you're using outsourced back office technology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So again, from that perspective, it's really good practice to have that research and due diligence process across all these areas that you can then prove at the, that you've got this, it's monitored on a continuous basis, and you're in control of all this. You've got the finger on the pulse as a business. And I'll come back to the threshold conditions here, because a lot of this is benchmarked back to those threshold conditions, which is all about the rudimentary basics of what the FCA would want to see from a regulated business. So that's obviously the office location, supervision, appropriate resources applied. You've got suitability, not just of the advice, but also suitability of people, right roles, right skills. Record keeping is up to scratch and up to date, and in real time as well. That's really important. So again, with RegTech and AI RegTech like Model Office, if the handbook rules change, our member firms get alerted straight away, so they can go into that particular area and assess and audit themselves. And you're looking at the fees, how the fees are structured, how you're dealing with complaints, redress, root causes of complaints, really important factor in their vulnerability and so forth. So I'd highly recommend you revisit these areas in the rule book when you're looking at this type of thing, if you're putting together a framework around this. And of course, the key areas are, it's not rocket science. We all should know them. It's systems and controls. It's it's conditions. It's all the stuff around about advice suitability, and so forth. So, and the threshold conditions and the principles. So there's lots in there that you might want to grapple with. But at the end of the day, this just lays it out for you in hopefully a meaningful format. And the type of questions that you may get from an inspector are, I've just chosen 3 areas here that we've seen, and from my experience, certainly when I was a practitioner. And again, it's not rocket science. This is what you'd expect a good compliance officer to be delivering and asking you. This is what I expect you'd have from Model Office, for example, when you're self-auditing on Model Office. So we incorporate a lot of this stuff into our diagnostic software, which looks at the qualitative data as well as the quantitative data. So from that side of it, this again shouldn't be new to you. You should have a firmer understanding of all these areas, but it's really good to keep revisiting it at least annually. Let's just refresh ourselves on the SMCR, because it's been a fair while since this, and I think the SMCR was a great piece of regulation, personally. It just focused on when it was a shift from a legal stance of looking at the firm that's responsible and accountable to the individuals in the business, which I think was needed in the across the whole industry, not just our sector. And of course, there you're looking at the mapping, operational mapping, responsibility mapping, what all the senior managers are up to, conduct rules, statements of responsibilities, duty responsibility, and prescriber responsibility. So ensuring that you've got the fit and proper stuff, and the record checks and so forth. That's all. Make sure that's all revisited. Make sure it's all up to speed. Included in a framework that if the FCA ever come knocking, that you could then pull on that, and you're confident that you could apply that, or if you're interviewed, you know your stuff on it. The role mapping, again, and making sure that you've got all that, or an organogram, if you like, in the business. And then we've got steps for outsourcing. A lot of people forget outsourcing, but again, outsourcing is a great tool to use when you're talking about business strategy and growing your businesses, but it also comes with risks, and we just need to ensure that we've got all that flagged up. So ownership of the relationship, the contract details, how they're reviewed, service level agreements, KPIs, key risk indicators, and so forth. So lots of common sense stuff, but again, it's worthwhile revisiting, as it is with your T&C stuff. So T&C, very front and center, much front and center of any regulatory visit, because we can't forget the people, and you've got the kind of the areas around the conduct and the competence there. So you've got the business, the behavioral stuff, and the skill sets that are under the focus from a regulatory perspective, and we need to make sure all that's up to speed. And the type of data that's covered, we all, one of the things that we do at Mo is really take a look at, what data do you need to ensure that you're complying against all the rules and regulations, and at the click of a button you can apply it to your compliance team and they can report on it. So these are all the key areas that the FCA is saying that they want to see delivered if they ever come knocking. And again, it's not rocket science. The operational resilience piece there in pretty much the middle is really important, all about, important business services, not irritable bowel syndrome, and looking at testing and setting and testing impact tolerances, lessons learned, training log, communication plans, self-assessment document. Even if this doesn't apply to you, it's good guidance, it's good practice. I would recommend that you put that in play. If you're outsourcing in particular, and looking at what you're up to internally as a business. Lines of defense, again, I say a lot of people forget about the third line of defense. The third line of defense is where we really are. And that's all about empowering internal audits for businesses. So you take ownership and accountability and responsibility internally for that, which you need to. And then that blends out, if you like, into that second line of defense, which a lot of firms have already got that, which is about the risk management, the compliance management, and so forth. And that's, so the FCA are going to be very interested in those two lines, those second and third line, as well as obviously the first line of defense, which is where the senior managers tend to sit in the business. If you get a regulatory visit and you and you're effectively looking at the areas that they may cover, there's kind of like some do's and don'ts here, which I'd highly recommend you look at. And the most important thing with any regulatory visit is the old adage about, you fail to plan, you plan to fail, right? So with anything like this, I'd highly recommend as a business that you've rehearsed this, you've done dry runs, you involve the whole team, you put together a framework for preparing for a regulatory visit, as we're talking about today. That is a training and competence area that you train the whole staff on at least once a year, so everybody's familiar with it. And there's good resources out there with all the professional bodies that you can take a look at. It gets you some CPD as well, which is always a bonus. So here we've got kind of like the do's, is your business strategy. So that plan I pulled up from the FCA website, that's a great place to start. Is it clearly articulated? Can you pretty much articulate your operating model? If you're asked on that, knowing your MI and your data, so that's where your technology can help you, your back office, your wealth management tech, how you're recording meetings and so forth, all that good SMCR stuff about accountability and responsibilities. Understanding your three lines of defense I've talked about, planning ahead and answering the question only, and explaining your levers for control, which is below. Now, levers for control is a bit of a social science term, and we use a lot of behavioral science behind what we do at Mo. But this is really about, there was a great book that was written, I think it was 1995 or 6 or something, by Robert Simons, and he wrote a book called How Managers Use Innovative Control Systems to Drive Strategic Renewal. Now, that's pretty management speak to me, but really what it's about is this levers of control. What is in your control that you can then put a framework around, something like a regulatory visit plan that everybody knows where they stand, everybody knows their stuff, and so it can be delivered in an efficient way. And the belief systems is really all about your core values as a business. So your mission, your value statements, statements of purpose, and so forth, ethics, strategy in the business. Boundary controls are more about really the risks to be avoided in the business. So your codes of conduct comes into that, your strategic planning comes into that, systems and controls, in the rule book and policies and procedures. And then the interactive control systems really is understanding what the uncertainties are. So you might remember that diagram about, we know what we know, we don't know what we don't know, blah, 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 blah. And the unknown unknowns. Well, from that's really covered here. And what we're looking at here is looking at your data analytics across qualitative and quantitative data, what that's showing up for you across the key risks in the business, and looking at what you're doing internally to manage risk management. So it could be, your meetings and how you're minuting your meetings and so forth. Looking at bias management, so going back to that paper TR16-1 from 2016, funnily enough, which Rory Percival wrote. Those of you remember Rory, and that is really all about challenging the status quo to make sure that everybody is aligned and understanding that the business is fit for purpose across all the key governance, risk, and compliance areas. And then you've got the diagnostic control system. So that's looking at how your tech, how you're measuring risks across the business, your validation standards, your incentive and compensation systems, remuneration systems, and so forth. Do they all fit the rules and regulations? And there's another great piece that came out from a regulator a few years back, which is an ongoing project for them, which is called the 5 conduct risk questions. And that is really focused on the banks, but it's something that we could blend into our world. And those 5 questions you can see on your screen are a really good way to start to take a look about how you're managing regulatory risk in your business. And again, that blends in really nicely to putting together a framework to prepare for a regulatory visit if it was ever to happen to you. Just with time, I've got some final thoughts here, which I've put together really based on experience working with compliance teams when I was at Towery, which is really looking at the obvious one: fail to plan, plan to fail. Conduct those dry runs. Mock interviews are really, really important, because when it came to the don'ts, you obviously don't want to going off piste. You don't want to be making things up. You don't want to give away too much information. All you want to do is deliver what's the information that's being asked. And that's a big area that a lot of firms fall down on, because they just like to talk and they get nervous. And if that's the case, then dry runs and mock interviews are going to help you there. It's a team effort, so get all the team on board. Don't think this is just a compliance area. It's not. It's a bit like GDPR. That just wasn't an IT area. It's across the business. SMCR, that wasn't a HR business. It's across the business. So the same thing applies here. So bring the team in, do some training on this, so that everybody knows and understands the whole process if it were to happen. And also talk about it's helpful for the team to know what the senior management have to do if they do get a questionnaire or a data information request from the FCA, and how that is tracked through the business and so forth. Deploy tech. So there's lots of tech out there, including RegTech, like Model Office, that does some really good stuff. I can see Charlie's on the call. I know he's got some good tech and so forth. And I think if you do your due diligence on this tech, and I know there's a whole kind of like wall of white noise at this moment in time about AI in this 4th industrial revolution that we're in, but there is some really good tech out there. So, for example, I mentioned meeting notes and minuting meetings, right? AI is great for that. You can use Copilot. I use, at the Model Office, we use Fireflies. There's Otter. There's lots of tech tools, AI driven, that you could apply to, again, showcase that you're managing all the risks across all these areas. And again, what Model Office does is it blends everything together, so you've got one dashboard to manage all that GRC risk in one place. Ensure you've understood and embedded the 3rd line of defense I talked about, so that internal audit. Don't point your finger and say that that's part of your compliance team who you outsource or internal. It's taking ownership for that internally across the business and the relevant individuals who are involved in that. Remain dispassionate, as I've talked about. Don't panic. That good old Dad's Army quote is really important, because we need to address the emotion here, because a lot of there's lots of emotional attachment with your business. You've grown your businesses, you've worked really hard, you've done really well, but there's a lot, you need to be a little bit dispassionate about this and remove the emotion when you're sat in front of an FCA inspector, for example. Think of this as a validation for all the good work that you've done. So it's a bit like the consumer duty. That's a validation for all the great work that you're doing. Yes, there are always areas that you can continue to improve on. Consumer duty for me, for firms like yourselves who are doing great work, it's all about just showcasing that you're joining the dots and you're doing really good stuff. And then, the stuff that you need to work on, you're evidencing that activity is happening there. And the key area is obviously with a data-driven regulator, our mantra at Model Office is if you haven't got the data, it didn't happen. And if you've got the data, it better have happened. And that really is front and foremost of where the FCA are now with this data-led approach, and where firms like your good selves kind of need to be. It used to be, if you remember, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. Well, those days are kind of gone. So that really is all the areas I kind of wanted to put as a positioning piece for you. I'm now going to hand back to Lee and answer any questions and queries that might come.
That's brilliant, Chris, as always. We'll go back onto gallery view. Remember, you're very welcome to come up on screen if you wish. And if you've got questions, you can ask on screen, or I'll be also monitoring the chat. Chris, great point there about it was always a thing I kind of always struggled to maintain, was making my meeting notes after client meetings. So this whole thing about AI for here, we've got Mark Whitcroft coming on a Friday live in a few weeks on meeting notes and using AI. So that may be of interest too. So over to attendees for questions, but I guess I will take the usual. Don't know why I've got a frog in my throat now. I'll take the usual, Chris, if I may, co-host privilege. I remember having an FCA visit. Actually, I should be honest, I think it was a PIA visit. That's how old I am. But actually, they came in very, very combative, quite confrontational, quite aggressive. Do you think that's still the case with regulatory visits, or have they kind of matured as a regulator?
Good question. If you read between the lines about where they are now, they're coming at it. I think that phrase that you've used, matured, is a really important one. I think they have matured, and I think they're now coming at this. Think of them as a critical friend. That's where they want to play. So Nick Hume, who spoke at the Consumer Duty Alliance from the FCA, that's the phrase he used. They want to be seen as a critical friend. So that friend piece, shouldn't really be seen. Critical friend shouldn't be really be seen as an oxymoron, if you like, opposites. So I think first and foremost, you've got to kind of like be on your toes for sure, and be on your game for sure, because you will get tested, you will get challenged, and that's where that dispassionate approach comes from. Trying to get to, and that's why you need to do the dry runs and the mock interviews and the running through your framework and your strategic planning and so forth are all around this, so you really know your stuff like never before. And the reason why I say that, I'm not being hard on businesses for that, because you do know your stuff, but this isn't front and center of what you're doing, and it shouldn't be, because you're out there with your clients, right? That's the most important part of my job when I was an IFA and when I was running teams of wealth management team. So from that side of it, I think it's that critical friend is the phrase that they're using now, and I would expect them to be probably firm but fair is probably the best way I could describe that, Lee.
Okay, thank you. All questions welcome, folks, as I've said in the chat. We haven't had another one yet, Chris, so I'll bung another one in. You said there, I think fairly early on in the presentation, that you thought SMCR was a really good piece of regulation and helpful. Can you just expand on that a bit for the attendees?
Yeah, so the SMCR was effectively a change in the law, really, or a change of use of law by the regulator, because historically, before the SMCR was around, it was really about the firm, and that was the key focus for the regulator. About the firm was up to a firm level. And then it switched then with the SMCR to take a look at the individuals and what, particularly the senior managers, on what they're up to, and those holding the regulatory permissions, and the SMF 16s, 17s for compliance, SMF 1s, and so forth. So, and it doesn't matter how small the business is, you could see that they divvied up the business, they segmented the businesses, so that yes, it becomes proportionate, but even so, even the small businesses, the 1RI firms, they still have responsibilities and accountabilities to, and the individual. And I always get the question, well, I've only got one person, or I've got two people. I don't have a board. Well, you do have a board. It's you, and you're wearing all the hats, right? So, and you've chosen to do that. Well, at the end of the day, so from that side of it, you hold that responsibility. But the good news is it's tailored down in the SMCR perspective, to give to taking a look at only certain areas that you need to comply with. So I think it was good for that. I also think it was good for the behavioural focus. So as I mentioned in the positioning piece, you've kind of got two key areas there. You've got the competence and the conduct. And so from that side of it, it's really looking at the skill sets, and that's where we were before the SMCR, but the conduct was really focused on under the SMCR. So from that side of it, there was a second tier, if you remember, of the conduct rules that was brought through on the senior manager side. And that's all about effectively the relationship with the regulator, and so forth. So I think the behavioural piece, and that tracks back all the way to how the FCA were launched in 2013. Those of you remember that, I was at the actual launch where Martin Wheatley stood up, and it was all about behavioural economics, and that is really was a dynamic shift in a way to focusing on decision making and individuals, and how they can effectively nudge and encourage people to make better decisions to protect the market.
Great, thank you. Yeah, listen, you know me, the whole behavioral finance piece I'm incredibly interested in, as are a lot of members. And we've got our behavior lives on monthly Fridays with Neil Page. And in fact, after our session now, I'm on a session with Dr. Daniel Crosby. So there's lots of that stuff going on. And so do you think the FCA themselves are now using AI to kind of track through, that kind of the behavioral trends that are going on within firms?
Well, they're using, as I mentioned, they're using things like web scraping, tools which use AI. They've got a big AI team. I don't know if you saw the AI lab that was launched by the FCA recently, and which is interesting, which we've already applied to that, being an AI RegTech. So what they're doing is two things. They brought out a great paper a couple of months back, which is their AI strategy, which I highly recommend anybody read. And so they're kind of looking at it in two ways. They're looking at it from the industry, about how the industry and the sector and the planning profession and so forth are using AI first and foremost, and making sure that's controlled from a regulatory perspective, because the UK has made the decision at a government level that they're not going to bring in specific AI regulation at this moment in time, like the EU has. Okay, I don't know if that's a good thing, by the way, personally, but that's that. Let's put politics to a side for next week when we have the budget. And then we've kind of got the key area about how they're applying it themselves. And so there's no doubt about it. They're toying with areas about looking at what the bad, how to identify a bad actor using AI quickly, how to engage a bad actor quickly, how to ensure that they can disable a bad actor quickly, again using AI tools. So all that, yes, that's absolutely on the radar and currently active with the FCA.
Okay, brilliant. So listen, that's fantastic. We're sort of at time. There have been no other questions, which is quite unusual, Chris. You've obviously delivered all the information people
were. It's a compliance talk, as I say. It's a Friday as well.
No, listen, I think it's the quality of your presentation. Everything was in there. So, as always, a huge thank you. These Friday Lives, as I said, they're getting much more common now. In fact, we've got a little queue of people coming on. As a community, we love to hear ideas for Friday Live sessions. We always try and respond to what's being asked for. So if there's anyone particularly...
Lee, before you... Sorry, there's one area I did mention and I forgot to actually really cover it.
Sure.
If you read into the DCO letter that came out October the 7th, that was really targeting, quite subtly, but it was targeting the consolidators.
Right. Yeah.
And I think there's a great paper that came out in 2017, which talked about if firms are out there, which a lot of firms are, great firms, doing it all the right way, about acquiring client bank. Okay. And this comes under the consumer duty now, obviously, because it's obviously about good outcomes and protecting that. And that also comes into an FCA visit. So not only are they interested in your business, but they're also interested in the businesses that you're acquiring. And that paper in 2017, I highly recommend anybody revisits it, because that's all about your client communications. It's all about our new service charges, simple things like that, and services. Are they kind of like explained properly to the clients who are coming, the old client that you bought that's coming on board? You've got client agreements. Have they been agreed? The new client agreements and so forth. You got provider facilitation of charges, how that works. Have you got new providers who are providing new charges? What are they? So you got that whole piece around that second outcome under the consumer duty about the price and fair value, which firms can actually be caught out on, I think, under that paper. And then you got the conflicts of interest, and you got appropriate charging structures I mentioned, and replacement business, that good old paper that I mentioned, 1211, I think. So cost benefit analysis is really important to showcase that there's a clear rationale of that you've done all this work about protecting those good outcomes for clients as you're buying that. And that the FCA will be really hot on that if you are a consolidator and you're acquiring businesses.
Okay, that's incredibly useful. We'll try and put as many of these resources up as we can when we post this later. Obviously, these sessions are recorded, so they're on demand, so you can go back and revisit. And we know that a lot of people watch them after the effect, or after the actual event. So thank you. Just as I was saying in wrapping up, if there's anyone you particularly want us to speak to, let us know. You know how to get hold of me in any of the usual ways. And it just leaves me to say a huge thank you to Chris for what was just a cracking session, of course, as always, and to everyone for turning up. I wish you every success, and try and dodge the rain over the weekend. And we hope to see you again on another Friday. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee. Thanks, folks. All the best.